Hello, everyone. Welcome. Um, my name is Derek Chen. I'm the Chief Equity and Assessment Officer at EQAO, the Education Quality and Accountability Office in Ontario, Canada. And I'm here with two co-presenters. I'll pass it on to V. By the way, my pronouns are he, him. V.
Thanks, Derek. Thank you. I'm V West. My pronouns are they and them, and I'm an equity education officer working with Derek, and happy to have Katie joining us.
Hello, everyone. My name is Katie Wilhelm. My pronouns are she, her. I'm an Indigenous designer and consultant, as well as a First Nations Collaborative Council member with EQAO. So happy to be here today. Derek?
Thanks so much. I'll have the slide deck up here. So our presentation today is called Call and Response, How a Large-Scale Assessment Organization Prioritized Indigenous Reconciliation. We always start our meetings with a land acknowledgement, and we will do so again with this session. We at EQAO recognize that we are located on land shared with many Indigenous communities. We honor the dish with one spoon wampum, which teaches us to care for the water, plants, and animals that sustain us, to preserve the earth for future generations, and to leave some resources as a sign of respect and care. Our office is situated in Toronto, which is covered by Treaty 13, also known as the Toronto Purchase. It is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. On this land, we are all treaty people. EQAO acknowledges historical and ongoing injustices endured by Indigenous communities in the province and across the country. As part of Ontario's education system, we are dedicated to the ongoing fulfillment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action, particularly numbers 10, 62, and 63, which the agency can help achieve. We commit to reconciliation and reciprocity with the guidance of Indigenous communities and perspectives, and we strive to learn from this knowledge and wisdom. At the agency, what we normally do after the land acknowledgement is we have a personal reflection. Today, we will consider our presentation that reflection. So on our agenda today, we have our 5 things that we're going to be covering. I'll start with some background information, followed by calls to action, our response, the results that we've seen at EQAO, next steps, and finally, a Q&A session. We had initially thought that you could participate here, but we are going to just have a moment of reflection in your own thoughts. So in your organization, are Indigenous perspectives or voices included in assessment design? Just think about that if you wouldn't mind for a minute. Okay, so a bit of background information. Okay, sorry, just one moment. So we'd like to begin with a brief description of who we are, along with some context about the relationship between Indigenous communities in Canada and Canadian governmental bodies. So first off, who we are. So EQAO, we are a board-governed agency of the Province of Ontario's Ministry of Education. We administer large-scale digital assessments of literacy and numeracy at key stages in students' kindergarten to grade 12 education. And we've just also added a teacher certification program called the Math Proficiency Test. The agency's goal is to provide data and evidence-informed insights into student learning to facilitate the success of each Ontario student. EQAO strives to continually enhance its high-quality large-scale assessment program to ensure it is equitable, inclusive, and reflective of Ontario's diversity so that all students can demonstrate their understanding of the provincial curriculum. And just a few facts here. As you can see, the population of Canada is approximately 41.65 million. Ontario, the largest province, populated province in Canada, is 16.17 million. And taking a look at some of the racial or demographics, identity demographics in Ontario, you see that the Indigenous population forms about approximately 3%. So we'll just give you a little bit of historical background here. In November 2005, the largest class action settlement in Canadian history, the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement, was approved by the courts. It specifies that Canada and certain religious organizations who operated Indian residential schools were responsible for harms and abuses committed against students. The settlement agreement includes directives to address the legacy of harms suffered at residential schools, including intergenerational effects that go beyond financial compensation for survivors and include funding for healing, education, truth and reconciliation, and commemoration. And just before I just missed the part around the language, just wanted to mention that we are using the word here, Indian residential schools. We no longer use the term Indian, but that is still the name of the residential schools, and it's based in the Indian Act. That is still actually part of legislation. So just using the language that's still in governmental use, as well as the word Aboriginal, which we no longer use that term outside of that governmental language. As a result, in 2007, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was formed, the TRC. 2007 is also the year the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP, was adopted by the UN General Assembly. In 2008, Prime Minister Stephen Harper stood in the House of Commons to offer, on behalf of the Government of Canada, an apology to Indigenous peoples in Canada for the abuse, suffering, and generational and cultural dislocation that resulted from assimilative, government-sanctioned residential schools. The apology specifically addresses the assimilative practices of the government, the forced removal of children from their families, the abuse suffered by many of those children, and the resulting effects of these policies. In 2015, the TRC published their final report. It includes the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada calls to action. Closer to home, in our 2021-2022 annual report, EQAO included a strategic priority which directly addresses the TRC calls to action. And then in 2022, a Chief Equity and Assessment Officer position was created. I was fortunate enough to get that position, and the EQAO Equity team was formed. Now let's take a look at the calls to action from a broad level. So in order to redress the legacy of residential schools and advance the process of Canadian reconciliation, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission created 94 calls to action, each demanding commitments from the Canadian government. The calls to action are divided into two categories. Numbers 1 through 42 seek to remedy systemic inequities that marginalize Indigenous peoples in Canada, and numbers 43 to 94 are concerned with societal inclusion, the education of non-Indigenous folks, and building policies and programming that affirm Indigenous rights. At EQAO, we have committed to responding to the applicable calls via our contributions to the Ontario education system through large-scale assessments, including data gathering and reporting, and through staff representation and education. EQAO's response to the calls to action began with policy changes. In 2021, advancing truth and reconciliation for and with Ontario's Indigenous students and their communities became an integral aspect of the EQAO mandate. Strategic Priority 2 from the annual report states, commit to action on all applicable Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommendations, and the development of an agency-wide equity, diversity, and inclusion plan. With this response to the calls to action began to solidify. These directives have been repeated and elaborated upon in subsequent policy documents, including the EQAO 2025 to 2028 business plan. Oops. Okay. Yes. So our response. In this section, we will be looking at 4 pieces here: policy, partnerships, professional learning, and unfortunately we couldn't find an alliteration for this, but assessment development. Policy provokes action. So let's take a quick look at this history here. As with any change, staff may experience discomfort and there may be reluctance. However, with the mandate of equitable policies which result in better service for deserving communities, the extra work soon becomes the regular work and gets embedded into daily processes. If done correctly, everyone gains insight into the barriers equity-deserving communities face. They also understand why and how their efforts can make a difference, and they can find additional ways to push equity even further. It was through an executive-level mandate that EQAO began to answer the calls to action. In 2022, as mentioned previously, a 3-member equity team was created. One of the responsibilities of the team is to address access for Indigenous students and additional equity-deserving communities on our assessments. We really want to ensure that students are able to best demonstrate their learning. And so with a team this size, we were able to implement a multifaceted approach. The first thing that had actually was done in conjunction with the position, the newly created CEAO position, was to contract an organization to do an equity audit. And based on the equity audit, they were to create an equity multi-year plan. And we're proud to say that both of those items have been completed, and we are currently in the middle of the second year of the 3-year multi-year plan. We also have a few other things. A very major component to any sort of equity work, and as well as part of this multi-year plan, was the establishment of collaborative councils. And we have established approximately 4 collaborative councils. One is and you'll hear a little bit more later, but the First Nations Collaborative Council, a Métis network, an Inuit network, and the Black Communities Collaborative Council. We also get involved in much professional learning for agencies, staff at all levels, as well as for our board members. An integral part to any equity work is the partnerships, and partnerships yield insight. So as mentioned previously, we set up several networks and collaborative councils. And so in doing so, we wanted to follow the very appropriate processes here. And so we reached out to the Chiefs of Ontario, and they are an organization that represents all the chiefs that are in the Ontario region. Their advice to us was to not go with a pan-Indigenous approach, but rather to serve each community individually. Now, we also recognize that First Nations, there are a multitude of First Nations in Ontario, but we have gone with a First Nations Collaborative Council, but separated it from the Métis and the Inuit, which have networks. We also, and let me go to the next slide. Just to go into a little bit more information about these 3. The First Nations Collaborative Council, there are 133 First Nations in Ontario. To ensure diverse views, membership includes different First Nations, urban and rural members, educators and non-educators, and elders and or knowledge keepers. Our Métis network. Métis communities emerged from a blending of European traders and First Nations people. The communities comprise a unique culture, customs, and practices. The Inuit network. Inuit are Indigenous people of the Arctic. Inuit are the smallest of the Indigenous identity populations in the province and the country. The Inuit network is the smallest collaborative group that we have. Now, I'm part of our work, and we work closely with our assessment team. Under the assessment unit team, they have a unit called the outreach team that does much work with First Nation schools. First Nation schools are federally funded. They are not part of the provincial system. However, many First Nation schools choose to take the EQAO large-scale assessments. We have an incredible team of outreach officers that go out to publicly funded schools, private schools, and First Nation schools. In the conversations that our officers have with First Nation schools, they wanted to have a tool that could be used to sort of bridge those conversations, to have something that was really unique to First Nations and took into account Indigenous ways of knowing, learning, and being. So our first thought, obviously, was to do this in collaboration with the First Nations community. We were very fortunate to have on the First Nations Collaborative Council a designer. And I'm going to bring on our designer in 1 second. But this tool really is for outreach work officers to have those conversations with schools, to talk about student achievement data, the data that we've collected as a result of completing the assessments, and to look at some strategies to work with those students to continue to increase student achievement for those students. And so I'm going to pass it along to Katie Wilhelm, who will take us through this beautiful design.
Yes, thank you so much, Derek. Hello, everyone. As you know, my name is Katie Wilhelm. I'm a registered graphic designer in Canada. I'm also an artist, I'm a consultant, and I'm a mother of a 10-year-old son who, during my time with the Collaborative Council, actually took the EQA assessment in grade 3. And I was able to give some of his unfiltered feedback to the council. I'm also a proud Indigenous woman from the Chippewas of Nawash First Nation and currently living in London, Ontario. As you know, I'm a member of the First Nations Collaborative Council with EQAO and excited to be here to chat with you about just a couple of the initiatives that I've been able to work on as a graphic designer and council member. The first on your screen here, you see what we call our placemat. So this, I want to share with you the artist statement and some of the rationale behind this design, and just share that the details and long conversations to create these pieces mimic the ways that Indigenous communities create policy, like treaties, in a circle and through humility, conversations that are centered in humility. So these couple pieces are practical ways that groups working within those colonial structures can honor First Nations protocols and cultures. So this placemat wheel features storytelling artwork with 4 directions and 4 topics for conversation around the circle, representing the value of all individual perspectives that First Nations hold. So the idea behind the artwork is to create a place and space for conversations through this reference to the medicine wheel teaching, where each direction, east, south, west, north, coordinates with those inner themes: plan, act, observe, and reflect, which in turn relate to the questions for our conversations, which this placemat is a center for. The arrows within the design demonstrate movement through the topics, while the slight rotation of the artwork encourages the viewer to rotate that document while in conversation. Shapes depicting the sun and moon appear in the center of the wheel, and this represents the story of the sun rising in the east and setting in the west. This also symbolizes the teaching that many First Nations enter the circle through the east door and honor their unique creation story by moving either clockwise or counterclockwise through the circle. I'll share a little bit in the presentation about the way that we get to some of these decisions. There are two wheels created in both directions to respect this teaching in the artwork, and the four directions and conversational themes are surrounded by circular elements representing sky domes and our world. And these shapes depict places of conversation such as longhouses, schools, and our homes. Within and between these sky dome shapes are colored circles that represent spirit orbs. These multicolored orbs represent all individuals around the circle, as well as spirits in the sky world and our relations, including eco-kin. The ribbons along the outer edge not only represent the four directions and topics, but also represent pride and joy in our Indigenous identity. The wavy shapes in the background of the document create these subtle quadrants in which the viewer can physically write their responses, but also represents four elements of air, water, fire, and earth. And overall, the placemat wheel aims to respect all perspectives of those in the circle while encouraging open conversation through storytelling and artwork. And all of these little artwork details that I discussed are these the pieces that create that authentic connection with those First Nations groups that we're talking to within this circle. Another piece that I'd love to share with you here today, before I give it back to Derek, is this piece about a visual land acknowledgement that I was honored to be able to create for EQAO. What is a land acknowledgement? I'm sure we've all heard this term, and there was one given at the beginning of this conversation, and I was hoping to share that land acknowledgements in Canada originated from Indigenous protocols of introducing oneself and recognizing the land and its original caretakers before all gatherings and ceremonies. So this contemporary practice grew in Canada after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action were released. For me, a good land acknowledgement calls in the spirits of the land, which changes the space in a special way that our ancestors and elders knew the benefit of many, many years ago. And today, many land acknowledgements are criticized as being a checked box when we talk about reconciliation and delivered without that original intention or meaning for which it was intended. I love the EQA land acknowledgement because it gives a space for reflection and a personal note towards the end. So creating this digital beadwork that you see on your screen illustrates the story of that land acknowledgement through the telling of the Anishinaabe 13 moon months calendar. It also appreciates an art form from my own nation of beadwork. So being able to create this digital beadwork that expands this piece to 4 seasonal graphics, which tells this story and also benefits the organization as a knowledge sharing tool on this important Indigenous worldview about how our world works. In summary, these graphics are rooted in the teachings of Anishinaabe lunar calendar, as I shared, 13-month calendar, and this artwork journeys through the 12 moons in our colonial calendar, each representing a sacred stage of growth and renewal. The winter moons guide us towards healing, enhanced vision, and spiritual awakening. The spring moons bring balance and renewal, and the summer moons reflect connection and emotional resilience. And the autumn moons reflect reflection, gratitude, and preparation, which is kind of the area that we're in now, just moving into our winter moon months. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to share some of these artwork pieces and some practical ways in which we're engaging with those First Nations school. At this point, I'll flip it over to Derek, and I'll see you in a couple of minutes. Derek?
Thanks so much, Katie. So as you could imagine, EQAO collects an immense amount of data, student achievement data, and that includes, as I mentioned before, First Nations students who are enrolled in publicly funded schools in Ontario, but also First Nation schools. We felt it would be extremely important to be able to work with this data appropriately. And so we established a First Nations Data Stewardship Advisory Committee, again, focusing on First Nations, though the principles of this committee would be applied to in a similar fashion to the data concerning Métis and Inuit students. So the EQAO, we are using the principles of OCAP. OCAP stands for Ownership, Control, Access, and Possession of Data. And we felt it very important that the members of the committee all take this training. So we all enrolled in the training. Everyone who is involved on the committee, as well as others who were interested, took the training, and it was a 2-day training session, as well as another session that was done online. So the purpose of the committee is to examine where the agency interacts with First Nations student data and to help inform and support the development of data stewardship policies, procedures, and guidelines for EQAO. EQAO strives to incorporate First Nations data governance principles within this work, within the legislative boundaries of the agency. So obviously we are bound by the provincial legislation, but we do our best to try to honor these principles. There have been situations where we have wanted to do research projects using the data that we collect on Indigenous and First Nation students, but this we didn't want to do it without any direction or idea conception formulated by First Nations communities. And so this committee will act as that advisory so we can move forward in collaboration with First Nations communities on these research projects. A large part of our work is around professional learning. Connection amplifies learning. And I'm going to pass it on to my colleague, V. West, to take us through this. Next.
Thanks so much, Derek. Connection amplifies learning. The equity team knows that if you can connect authentically with learners, they will form stronger connections with what they're learning. And this applies to our internal professional learning, just as it does to students in the education system. This is not, there we go. So one of the core beliefs of our equity team is that we can help maximize test fairness by creating an environment of awareness in the workplace. The more each staff member understands and can recognize inequities occurring around them, the more likely they are to advocate for fairness in their own work. So to ensure that the best outcomes from our professional learning activities, we endeavor to make them relevant, to make them engaging, and to ensure that they are making connections. We make them relevant to the equity needs of the present moment and to the work. Our professional learning on topics includes addressing discomfort in conversations about equity, anti-racism and allyship, implicit bias, microaggressions, socioeconomic status, disability and inclusion, mental health and neurodivergence, and more. We make them engaging by offering a variety of learning methods, both mandatory and optional, to staff. We hold an equity book club, an equity film club. We offer additional qualifications courses for any education staff who might want to bring this into classroom once they're finished with their time at EQAO. People are invited to attend external speaking events, workshops, webinars, conferences, including next week, we're going to Inspire, which is the national gathering for Indigenous education in Canada. And making connections. We help the staff to make connections between professional learning topics and the students who write the tests, to their coworkers, and even to themselves. And we do this by modeling authentic connection and vulnerability, by sharing our own humbling discoveries and mistakes that we ourselves have made as we learn. It is a little, there we go. So again, a moment of reflection. What outcome are you hoping for when including Indigenous voices in assessment? So as you listen to what we've been doing and why we want to do it, what are you hoping for your own assessments? Maybe cultural authenticity, perhaps improved engagement, better assessment quality and relevance to the community's writing, or greater community trust. Increasing engagement increases achievement. Existing research suggests that when a test taker identifies with the content of an assessment and can see themselves represented in test items, they experience a greater sense of engagement. Documented evidence affirms that higher levels of engagement are related to higher achievement. EQAO gathers data on students' sense of belonging, which may relate to their engagement levels. As we see here, EQAO data from 2022-2023 demonstrates a clear positive correlation between students' self-reported sense of belonging and their achievement results across various age groups. So, assessment developments. With those research findings, they've led us to seek out best practices for developing assessments that will increase the engagement levels of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis students. And recommendations from the literature are clear. To raise engagement levels, test takers must see themselves represented in the assessment. This can be achieved by including culturally responsive and relevant test items. These items must be created by development teams with the appropriate knowledge, lived experience, and training. And once written, EQAO assessment items with Indigenous content must be reviewed by the aforementioned collaborative councils to ensure that they represent First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities authentically and respectfully and are appropriate for Indigenous students. So, what steps have we taken to accomplish this? We began by updating the guiding principles and criteria for EQAO assessment committees. Members of these committees are the ones who create and review content for our assessments. The two guiding principles are as follows: to include content in an EQAO assessment that represents the diverse population of Ontario students, with an emphasis on First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities and equity-deserving groups. And two, to purposefully and authentically include content that celebrates a variety of races, cultures, and marginalized communities. Item development that fits these principles requires training. Many of our assessment development and review committee members have worked with us for a number of years and have received prior training that runs counter to our updated direction. In previous years, item developers were directed to avoid culturally specific content in favor of creating so-called neutral items that avoid cultural biases. The prevailing belief has been that neutrality is the key to delivering an equitable experience for all test takers. But our new guidelines and principles for content development and review training modules highlight the research findings that support the rationale for EQAO's changes. And the following slides are excerpted from the training module to really highlight the research so that committee members will understand. This is from the training. One of the principal duties when developing a large-scale assessment is delivering an equitable experience for all test takers. In a 2025 publication, Catherine Taylor and Carla Evans tell us, quote, measurement and assessment specialists at all levels of the education community recognize the need for new ways of thinking about and organizing assessment so that marginalized students, low-income students, students of color, English learners, students with disabilities, are no longer marginalized by our measurement and assessment practices. In our commitment to creating assessments that are equitable, accessible, and fair, EQAO is implementing strategies grounded in literature, such as incorporating culturally responsive and relevant content into the assessments. As a member of an assessment development committee, you will be helping EQAO with this commitment. As documented by researchers in the education measurement field, including Guillermo Solano Flores, Randy Bennett, and Jennifer Randall, neutral contexts do not exist. Assessments are based on knowledge, skills, and practices that are valued in culturally specific ways. When students from different cultural backgrounds are assessed with the same instrument, fairness becomes an issue. As a result, students who don't see the same set of cultural experiences may not have equal access to the content items. Walker et al., writing in 2023, agree, saying, designing engaging assessments should benefit everyone generally, but it may have a particularly positive impact on historically excluded students. Critics believe that so-called context-free assessments are not devoid of context. Instead, they default to the dominant white culture and only remove context and references that are specific to identities or cultures that do not align with the dominant culture. It is then possible that the removal of context from assessment content is particularly disadvantaging historically excluded students by limiting their ability to connect with assessment content and meaningfully engage with it. Published findings additionally document that when students see themselves and their educational community reflected in assessments, it enhances their sense of belonging and their engagement levels. These conclusions are foundational to instructional materials, such as the textbook pictured above, which includes a section called Integrating Inclusion and Belonging into Assessments. It says, students who see themselves represented in assessment design and delivery are more likely to feel valued and engaged in the learning experience. For example, the people represented in images, scenarios, and examples in assessments will impact the extent to which a student feels as if they belong. Vreta is the company EQAO works with as data processor for digital assessments, for administering tests and compiling test results. A recent article published on their website says, from a practical perspective, culturally responsive assessment design actively engages students, values their cultural identities, and fosters meaningful learning experiences that allow diverse students to demonstrate their true knowledge and skills. So again, all of that to highlight for the assessment committee members, those developing, those reviewing, just how important it is to be inclusive of the cultures that the students who will be writing the assessments belong to, with a special emphasis on Indigenous students. So following this brief literature review, the Guiding Principles training materials offer some practical tools for committee members, including the EDI criteria and content considerations tables, which are guidelines for content development and review. We say to ensure assessment items depict cultural practices and experiences authentically, item developers and reviewers will be asked to draw on their personal lived experience and professional expertise. There are criteria and content tables for 4 additional equity themes, but the area of highest priority is Indigenous content. So the opportunities column here considers positive ways the theme can be explored, and the cautions column calls attention to undesirable ways of representing the theme that must be avoided. So for the theme of people who are First Nations, Métis, or Inuit, opportunities ask, does this item accurately and respectfully represent people, events, experiences, traditions, and/or celebrations from First Nations, Métis, and/or Inuit communities? Was it written by or in collaboration with someone who identifies as First Nations, Métis, or Inuit? Does it name the specific nation or community on which the item content is based? And as a caution, does this item reinforce a colonial perspective or stereotype? So in summary, EQAO's culturally relevant and responsive assessments must align with Ontario curriculum expectations, affirm the identity or culture being discussed, elevate and celebrate cultural frames of reference and stories other than those from Eurocentric or dominant cultures, and be inclusive of historical and contemporary ways of knowing. And another moment of reflection for your assessments. What is the biggest barrier to authentically including Indigenous perspectives in the assessments produced by your organization? A few moments to reflect on that. And I'll pass it back to Derek to talk about the results from our responses. Thanks, Derek.
Thanks, V. So I'm really excited to show this work. And again, much credit to the assessment teams for putting these together, in this case, the numeracy team. We have this sample item here, structure from First Nations culture. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy are people of the Longhouse. Historically, longhouses were used as homes with 4 to 12 families living in them. Bark was used to cover the exterior. So here, students are asked to do this measurement and solve this problem. Wonderful representation. And a reading selection. This was a feature on a First Nations artist. So these are released questions. They're available on our practice test, this one in particular. So if you visit our website, you'd be able to read this passage through. But this is just one example of many that we have that incorporate First Nations, as well as Métis and Inuit characters or historical figures, prominent figures, and really proud to have that representation. One of the committees we have that runs under the assessment team is the EQAO Student Engagement Committee. And we sometimes get to work with this committee. Wonderful, wonderful student representation from across Ontario, very diverse perspectives. And we have a testimonial from a student. I feel really encouraged when I see questions or stories about people who are like me in my schoolwork. It makes me feel included and acknowledged. For instance, reading a story with a protagonist who shares my cultural background makes the subject matter more relatable and enriches my learning experience. It's like seeing a reflection of myself in the curriculum, which boosts my confidence and makes me more interested in participating. As we mentioned previously, we work very closely with staff, and we do a lot of professional learning. You saw from the list that V presented. And we also want to see what the metrics are. So in a staff survey, we asked them these questions. I'm aware of barriers that equity-deserving communities face, which are present in my work at the agency. And another question, when I become aware of barriers that equity-deserving communities face, which are present in my work at the agency, I advocate for changes that will create greater equity. And as you can see, the responses before this session compared to the responses after the session, there has been progress made on both of these constructs. And some very meaningful staff testimonials. I have found the work by the equity team in the past 2 years to be revolutionary. In this process, I have been learning to be brave, to be comfortable with my discomfort, to become aware of my unconscious biases, and to own my mistakes. So thanks to Sue for that one. The equity team has played a significant role in molding the understanding, mindset, processes, and practices gradually toward a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive culture here at EQAO. That was from Nosheen. Thanks to Nosheen for that one. As mentioned previously, we do have that First Nations Collaborative Council, and as you had heard, Katie is a member of that council. I'm going to pass it on to her to provide her perspective of being a member on the council.
Thanks so much, Derek, and proud to be able to quickly share with you here at the end some of my reflections of my time on this council. Our work on the council includes reviewing professional learning and assessment items to make these more inclusive to Indigenous individuals in First Nation schools. And, you know, sometimes these groups can feel like a checked box and not actually producing any meaningful action, and it can feel performative. And what makes this group feel different is the centering of Indigenous voices, the open engagement with the diverse voices from diverse leaders at the very beginning, from the top down. And speaking for myself on the council, My voice is centered when I can feel heard, I see the progress, I hear the accountability towards these actions and the accountability towards the inactions as we see opportunity towards actions that build humility and trust in our circle and with those First Nations. And that ability to share, which contributes to that feeling of being heard. And just speaking to the feedback process a little bit. And another element that makes this council successful is that this work takes a long time. We feel very open and allowed to have conversations, and we pick apart each and every detail, like I shared that placemat with you, and flesh out fully with respectful and honest conversation about the negative pieces as well, continuing to ask why and how until we have a solution that we can all trust to move us forward in a good way and that everyone can live with. So I'd like to leave you, before I pass it to Derek, with this thought. For others looking to build the same model as EQAO, my suggestion would be to build in more time than you think. As I shared, the Anishinaabe moon calendar has 13 months, so we often feel like we have a little bit of a longer time. Thank you so much for having me. I'll pass it off to Derek. Miigwech.
Thanks so much, Katie, and so glad that you're on our council. Another testimonial from the First Nations Collaborative Council. I'm honored to serve as a member of EQAO's First Nations Collaborative Council since 2023. This work is deeply important to me as it directly supports the advancement of Indigenous education across Ontario. Working closely with fellow council members and EQAO's team, I have experienced their genuine commitment to ensuring First Nations, Inuit, and Métis identities are reflected and celebrated within educational assessment. What sets this collaboration apart is how EQAO actively embeds Indigenous perspectives into their processes and culture, rather than simply acknowledging them. Through my presentation to EQAO staff regarding Indigenous education and our ongoing council meetings, I have seen the organization take concrete steps to ensure their assessments are equitable and culturally responsive for all students. This is not performative work. This is authentic reconciliation in action, and I'm proud to support EQAO as they build stronger, more respectful relationships with Indigenous communities. And so a big thanks to Andre Obonswin, who is head of Indigenous Affairs at the Toronto Catholic District School Board, for that. And our final piece is just around next steps. So we will continue to engage with Indigenous partners. We hope to initiate research projects on topics identified by Indigenous communities as areas of interest. And as I mentioned previously, this would be done in conjunction and collaboration with the First Nations Data Stewardship Advisory Committee. So we could possibly take a look at assessment items, to look more closely at achievement outcomes, and to see that if and how large-scale assessments and Indigenous ways of knowing, learning, and being can be reconciled. And then finally, to continue to seek guidance from Indigenous communities as we respond to their calls to action. These are just some of the next steps that we intend to embark upon. And we have a time for some questions. And just before we get to the questions, so that we have time, I just want to put a plug in for the 51st IAEA conference, which EQAO is hosting. So EQAO, in partnership with the International Association for Educational Assessment, IAEA, and VRETA, is proud to host IEA's 51st annual conference in Toronto, Ontario, under the theme Trust, Transparency, and Technology in Educational Assessment. The conference will bring together global leaders, researchers, practitioners, and policymakers to explore how assessment systems can be designed and delivered to be more equitable, innovative, and trustworthy in a rapidly changing world. So thank you for that mini commercial break there. And just heading back to the Q&A now, and we're open to any questions that you might have. So we've got a question here. Thank you for an informative session. Thank you. Thanks for attending. Is the EQAO equity team also responsible for addressing equity concerns and priorities for EAL students and students with accessibility barriers? So EAL, I would imagine, is similar to what we would term English language learners. I'm hoping that's the same. And students with accessibility barriers, and again, students with disabilities. So we do work closely with the assessment teams on these. The assessment teams have built in much assistive technology and tools that are built right into the assessment. So that has helped an enormous amount from what we understand from students with disabilities, learning disabilities, and other physical disabilities as well. In terms of English language learners, we continue to work with partners, community partners, in and around students who are acquiring the language. Students who are at the early stages of English language proficiency are not required to take the test. They are asked to take the test when they have achieved a level of English proficiency that could bear successful outcomes on the test. So, but we do work with the community agencies, and the assessment team especially works very closely to ensure that we do have items that are accessible to English language learners. And maybe V, do you want to take this question on? Can you explain the phrase equity deserving communities? It's new to me, and I'm wondering about its origins and its application.
Sure. This is a term that we use here more often than using something like marginalized or equity seeking. It means those communities, those individuals who face systemic barriers and deserve to have equitable access to everything. So that basically is what the term means. They deserve to have an equitable experience. And now, whether that be any kind of physical barriers, any kind of mental health barriers, and as we've been talking about, cultural barriers that are built right into our education system. And as we were talking about, the culturally relevant and responsive assessment items, there are barriers in there when we are only privileging one set of people, one community. So those from without that community, from outside that community, deserve to have equitable questions. Therefore, equity deserving communities. If that, I hope that clears that up. And I would say it could be applied anywhere you might use something like marginalized or equity seeking, or I can't even think of any others because we use equity deserving now so often, but it does mean those with less power, those that are from the non-dominant culture, in whatever culture you're talking about, whether that's ability or mental health or language or culture.
Can you provide some advice and best practices for initiating dialogue with Indigenous organizations, groups, as a precursor to hopeful future partnerships and collaboration? Yes. So in our case, we are fortunate to have, as I mentioned, that organization, the Chiefs of Ontario. They helped us with the initial establishment and creation of the First Nations Collaborative Council. And once we had that sort of created, then working diligently with the members, and to do so in a way that we are really demonstrating humility. We approach it with a sense of humbleness, not knowing that we will make mistakes, as Katie mentioned. Western thought, Eurocentric thought, is to speed through things, but we do know that things take time. So just knowing that, I've heard that, from obviously several Indigenous folks, that we're always kind of in a rush, looking at the clock, and just to take our time to think things thoroughly and to ensure that we have that authentic collaboration and consultation. There are obviously many book resources. There was one book by Bob Joseph. Actually, it was a book that we covered in our Equity Book Club, and it's about establishing relationships with Indigenous folks and knowing how to do so in an appropriate manner. So I would recommend, I'm so sorry I can't recall the exact title, Indigenous Relationships, it might be called, I think.
Indigenous Relations, I think, is it?
Yeah, relations, right?
Yep.
Yes. I would recommend maybe picking up that book, has many practical tips. I should ask here, Katie, if you want to chime in here.
Oh,
Your perspective.
Always important to center Indigenous voices when we're talking about Indigenous folks, so I appreciate that. Just a couple things came to mind. One is to listen more than you speak when we're working with Indigenous folks, and the other is to accept invites more than you give invites. And these are two very practical ways for initiating respectful dialogue with Indigenous groups.
Thanks.
I'd love to chime in a tiny bit, of course, right?
Of course.
I'd love. I'm saying this as a white person, as the white person in the room. Don't come to a conversation thinking you have the answer, or that what you're about to give is the best gift ever. Understand that this is like a nation-to-nation talk. You come with a certain amount of power. Understand that you are meeting someone that has power as well. And you might have a great idea, offer it only as an idea, not as a solution. And that way you can have a dialogue, because I can only bring my perspective and the things I've been fortunate enough to learn. I can't have somebody else's perspective, and especially the perspective of a community with millennia of experience that I can only dream of learning about. So that's a thing that Eurocentric culture tends to do, is we kind of crash in with solutions and then expect that everybody to take us up on our amazing offer of help. But as Katie's saying, make an offer and then listen and wait for a good long time to have this information that you've given be received, be thought about, be considered, because the considerations are about a full community, which is one of the great things learning from Indigenous ways is the thought process is more than individual. It's about a community. So that's my bit of learning that I have, and I hope that rings true for you, Katie, and for others.
So I see there's only 40 seconds left here. And a very familiar name here, Tamara Phillips. Thank you for sharing the work of your team. Is it possible to access the placemat that Katie shared? Would love to read it. We can certainly share it with you tomorrow. And we will see how we could share it even more publicly. We'll speak to the assessment team, the outreach team, to see if we can make that more available, perhaps on our website. Thanks for that. I think with only 8 seconds left, I think that takes us to the end. On behalf of Katie and V, I would just like to say thank you so much for attending our session. We hope that you picked up something from this workshop. Oh, I see another question here. Do we have time? I'm not sure. Can you provide
it's the same question.
Oh, no, same one. Okay, perfect. Yeah. So again, thank you so much for attending our session. Again, we hope you picked something up. Please do reach out to Indigenous folks. Ensure, like you say, Katie, you're listening more than you're speaking. And we are so grateful for the authentic, true, heartfelt, and sincere relationships that we've formed with Indigenous partners. So once again, thank you all for your participation, and wishing you a wonderful rest of the day.